Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Monday, May 27th, 2024. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today, at least 35 killed in Rafah massacre. So this article is from Middle East Eye, really heavy Israeli airstrikes in Rafah, and they hit one area where Palestinians were sheltering in tents. And there's just a lot of horrific videos showing these tents on fire and burnt bodies being pulled from the fire and dead children, really horrific stuff. So the Gaza government's media office said late on Sunday that at least 35 people had been killed and dozens wounded in Israeli airstrikes on a center for displaced people near the Palestinian territory's far southern city of Rafah. The strike took place in Tel al-Sultan neighborhood in western Rafah, where thousands of people were taking shelter after many fled the eastern areas of the city, where Israeli forces began a ground offensive over 2 weeks ago. I believe this was supposedly one of the safe zones. The airstrikes came just 2 days after the International Court of Justice had ordered Israel to immediately halt its military offensive. We'll get into that more in the next story. So the Gaza media office said, quote, "The Israeli occupation committed a horrific massacre by bombarding intensively and intentionally the UNRWA's Barasat Displacement Center northwest of Rafah Governorate," end quote. And UNRWA there, that's the Palestinian UN Relief Agency. So apparently this was a UN displacement camp. So Gaza's Civil Defense Agency said that Israeli strikes had killed and wounded at least 50 people in the area, where it said 100,000 displaced people live. And I saw Israel is claiming that they killed like one or two Hamas deputy commanders or something, and they confirmed that they launched airstrikes in the area. And that's what they're claiming. But again, you see the videos, you just see these tents on fire, and it looks like a lot of women and children were killed. One pregnant woman was killed as well. And earlier on Sunday, Israel's army said at least 8 rockets were fired towards central areas of Israel from Rafah. And Hamas's armed wing said in a post on Telegram that it had targeted Tel Aviv with a large rocket barrage in response to the Zionist massacres against civilians. And I believe this was the first time since like January that they were able to fire rockets into Israel. There was no reports of anybody being injured or anything in those rocket attacks. All right, so the next one here. So this is what happens after the ICJ orders Israel to halt military operations. It seems like they increased the airstrike, the bombing of Rafah in response to this ruling. So this article is from Kyle Ansel, and he wrote this up on Friday when the news broke. The International Court of Justice ruled that Israel must halt military operations in Rafah. The court made the ruling after South Africa appealed to take action as Israeli military operations in the southern region of Gaza have displaced nearly 1 million people. And the UN is saying around 900,000 people have fled Rafah now. And of course, the assault has prevented aid deliveries as well. So here they have it. They're explicitly ordering Israel to halt military operations in Rafah. I saw, Israel's claiming that their ruling left room for them to continue operations in Rafah. But I read, looking at the ruling, it explicitly says that Israel must cease, operations in Rafah. So I don't know how they're trying to say that there's a loophole. But again, that shows that they are concerned about this, that they're not just, they are rejecting it, obviously, but even the fact that they're trying to justify it in some way, using the ruling, shows that they are definitely worried about this. And I haven't really seen a big response from the U.S. about this yet. I'm sure, obviously, they're rejecting this. They're rejecting the whole case, the whole genocide case against Israel. But I think the thing that Israel's worried about, and I'm sure the U.S. is worried about, because just for the PR purposes, they're not going to want to do this again, is if the UN Security Council, I'm sure one member of the council is going to at least have the idea to put a resolution forward backing up this ruling from the ICJ for Israel to halt operations in Rafah, and then they're going to need a veto from the U.S. because I don't think China or Russia, I'm sure they would support it. They've supported the other ceasefire resolutions. And I see Kyle put in a quote here from Senator Lindsey Graham, which I will read. He said, quote, "As far as I'm concerned, the ICJ can go to hell. The ICJ's ruling that Israel should stop operations that are necessary to destroy 4 battalions of Hamas killers and terrorists who use Palestinians as human shields is ridiculous. This will and should be ignored by Israel," end quote. But again, you know, the international, when we talk about the international pressure on Israel, now you have the ICC warrants. Just the ICJ genocide case in general is adding to that pressure, and now this ruling, and it's a lot of pressure on the U.S. I mean, the U.S. doesn't seem to care to have to stand alone to support Israel, but you know, you hope that these things might make a difference. All right, so the next one here: aid trucks enter Gaza after weeks. So this article is from Al Jazeera. Aid trucks are entering Gaza through Kerem Abu Salam, or Kerem Shalom crossing as it's known in Israel. So aid trucks are entering through that crossing now as the living conditions of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians continue to deteriorate under Israel's relentless war on the Palestinian enclave. Egypt's state-affiliated Al-Kahari TV said on Sunday it shared a video showing aid trucks entering Gaza through the crossing. Aid officials said that 200 trucks loaded with aid are set to enter the strip. Not sure if that's exactly how many made it in, and it's not really clear how it's going to, you know, if there's distribution is possible, if that aid can reach people in Rafah. The Kerem Shalom crossing is located at the intersection of Israel, Gaza, and Egypt, so it is close to the Rafah border crossing. The first 4 trucks to enter Gaza carried fuel for hospitals and desalination plants. And so hopefully, you know, hopefully all 200 got in to get some aid into people. But again, just the situation, the distribution, I think, is the question here. All right. So the next one here, IDF negotiator says that there will be no hostage deal. So an Israeli military officer involved in the indirect hostage deal negotiations with Hamas has expressed frustration with the government of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, according to a report from Israel's Channel 12. So this is interesting. And the report said that Major General Nitzan Alon told Israeli military officials that Israel would not reach a deal with Hamas under the current government. And he's blaming the government here. He said, quote, "We are desperate. With this government formation, there will be no deal," end quote. So he also explained that it would be possible to restart military operations in Gaza, even if Israel agreed to a deal that would include a commitment to a permanent ceasefire, which has been Hamas's main demand. So this is interesting as well. Basically, what he's saying is that even if we agreed to end the war, if we agreed to withdraw from Gaza, we could always restart military operations. And that's something I've always thought as well, that Israel could just, you know, find an excuse to restart things if they did agree to it. And I'm sure Hamas is aware of that as well. But I think it goes to show that, you know, Netanyahu doesn't want a pause because he wants to keep this thing going. But anyway, I'll read his quote because it's just interesting the way he put it. He said, quote, "The deal I'm pushing for would provide for the return of all the hostages, while Hamas insists that it must provide for an end to the war. I told the Prime Minister that it will be possible to return to fighting at any given moment," end quote. So in response to this report, the IDF insisted that Alon was taken out of context, kind of denying what he said, essentially. But it's, you know, interesting. This was reported all over Israeli media. And Netanyahu's office released a statement criticizing what Alon said. The statement said, quote, "The clashes from within the negotiating team only strengthen Hamas's position, harm the families, and distance the release of our hostages," end quote. So hostage deal negotiations have been suspended since about the time Israel launched its attack on Rafah and captured the Rafah border crossing. But there are reports saying that they're going to resume sometime this week. William Burns, the head of the CIA, just met with the Mossad chief and Qatar's prime minister in Europe, and they were talking about restarting the negotiations, so that might happen soon. But I think it's very clear that Netanyahu doesn't want a deal. The ministers in his government don't want a deal. So I think they're just going to try to keep this thing going. All right, so the next one here, U.S. vessels supporting Gaza Pier wash ashore. So this is another one from Kyle. And this whole Pier project has been such a disaster. So 4 vessels that are part of the U.S.-built pier stretching from Gaza thousands of feet into the Mediterranean Sea have broken off and washed ashore. So on Saturday morning, rough seas broke off these 4 vessels that appear to be serving as part of the pier. So the CENTCOM said, quote, the vessels broke free from their moorings, and 2 vessels are now anchored on the beach near the pier. The 3rd and 4th vessels are beached on the coast of Israel near Ashkelon. Efforts to recover the vessels are underway with assistance from the Israeli Navy, end quote. So I would guess it sounds like they're 4 vessels. They're probably pretty small. 2 of them might not have had anybody on them, and those ones washed ashore, and then the other 2, they were able to drop the anchor. But it's just the weather has been pretty rough there, I guess, for this project. And that's why we had the other day, I went over that story of 3 U.S. troops being injured. And I don't know exactly what the circumstance was, but I'm sure it was something related to rough seas or something. But it's just this whole thing is a disaster. You know, they said that they started sending more aid into Gaza from this pier, but it's still like barely a drop in the bucket. As of May 23rd, which was Thursday, 41 trucks were reported to have delivered food. So all this work, $320 million, instead of just pressuring Israel to open the border crossings, they got 41 trucks in, and some of those might have been diverted. All right, so the next one here, Israeli military police probing reservist calling for insubordination. So this article is from Haaretz. An IDF reservist was questioned Sunday morning by the Israeli military police on suspicion of being the masked man who appeared in the video calling for mass insubordination in the IDF. The military police identified the suspect, a resident of Herzliya, on Saturday night and is conducting the investigation. So this video was initially uploaded by right-wing Israeli television host Yinon Magel. It shows a IDF soldier wearing fatigues with a mask and is armed. So what's interesting is that he uploaded it, and then Yair Netanyahu's son, then shared it around. He ended up deleting the post. But what this soldier was calling for was essentially, I wouldn't say a coup because he was supporting Netanyahu, basically calling for insubordination against the military brass, I guess, if they're giving them orders that go against the plans to occupy Gaza long term. I'll just read what the masked soldier said. The soldier said, quote, "We will listen to one leader, and it is not the defense minister or the chief of staff. It is the prime minister. Think carefully about who you plan on handing over the keys to. We reservists do not intend to hand the keys of Gaza over to the Palestinian Authority or to any Hamas, Fatah, or other Arab entity," end quote. So kind of apparently the soldier was saying that he was directly addressing Netanyahu when he said that part, that they will not hand the keys of Gaza over to the Palestinian Authority or basically any Palestinian group. And that's something you do hear Netanyahu say. And this comes after Gallant kind of challenged Netanyahu on the long-term plan for Israel, saying that he wouldn't agree to an Israeli military occupation. And again, it's really something that this was uploaded and then shared by Netanyahu's son, who I think is like kind of an unofficial spokesman for the Israeli government or something. All right, so the next one here, Stoltenberg calls for NATO arms to hit Russia. So on Friday, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg joined calls for Ukraine to be able to use NATO-provided weapons to strike Russian territory, a step that would mark a major escalation in the proxy war. Stoltenberg told The Economist, quote, "The time has come for allies to consider whether they should lift some of the restrictions they have put on the use of weapons they have donated to Ukraine, especially now when a lot of fighting is going on in Kharkiv, close to the border. To deny Ukraine the possibility of using these weapons against legitimate military targets on Russian territory makes it very hard for them to defend themselves," end quote. So Russia's offensive in Kharkiv has prompted calls from many members of Congress, including House Speaker Mike Johnson, for President Biden to allow Ukraine to use U.S.-provided missiles in strikes on Russian territory. This is something I've been covering quite a bit lately because it's very concerning. Russia has made clear that they would do something big in response to this. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is reportedly leading the charge within the administration to get this restriction lifted. And just to remind you again, I know I've said this a lot lately, but I think it's really important. You had David Cameron, the British Foreign Secretary, recently say that Ukraine could use British missiles to hit Russian territory. Russia summoned the British ambassador to Moscow and said, if that happens, if Ukraine uses British missiles on our territory, we will target British military sites in Ukraine, because we know there's a small number of British soldiers in Ukraine, but they said in Ukraine and beyond. So, and it is important to point out that in a way, the NATO has already crossed a red line of Russia's by letting Ukraine use the missiles to strike Crimea. They're using the ATACMS and the Storm Shadow missiles to target Crimea quite a bit, it seems like. But it does seem like Russia has kind of drawn another red line when it comes to the attacks on territory inside the Russian mainland. And you have hawks in the U.S. downplaying the risk of escalation. You see all the think tankers do this, but Russia just conducted nuclear drills, simulated the use of nuclear weapons directly in response to provocative rhetoric from Western officials. They're sending a message. And to downplay that, I even read something, I forget, I wish I remembered who it was. It was somebody from some think tank said, they just did nuclear drills. It's not like they're actually using nuclear weapons. It's like, what do you think the next step could be? I mean, it's just the attitude that these people have is just completely reckless, all to keep this proxy war going. All right, so the next one here, the U.S. gives Ukraine a new $275 million weapons package. So this was on Friday that the Biden administration announced a $275 million weapons package for Ukraine that includes ammunition for the HIMARS rocket systems, artillery shells, anti-tank weapons, and other types of military equipment. The weapons are being provided under the Presidential Drawdown Authority, which allows President Biden to ship equipment straight from U.S. military stockpiles to Ukraine. So since President Biden signed a bill into law last month that included over $61 billion for the proxy war in Ukraine, his administration has used over $9 billion to send more weapons to Ukraine. So they've already used over $9 billion of that. And the most significant package was worth $6 billion using the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, and that allows the U.S. to purchase weapons for Ukraine. That means it could take years for them to actually be delivered. And we know this aid is not going to help Ukraine win the war. It is only going to prolong the conflict. As Russia has every advantage right now in manpower, weapons, their ability to manufacture weapons. They're not reliant on another country for their war effort. They're making their own weapons and all that. So, and the Pentagon also released a fact sheet that said that it had committed more than $51 billion for Ukraine in weapons. That's just in military equipment alone, since Russia launched its invasion in February 2022. And according to the full list of weapons included in this package is ammunition for the HIMARS, 155 millimeter and 105 millimeter artillery rounds, 60 millimeter mortar rounds, TOW missiles, Javelin and AT-4 anti-armor systems, precision aerial munitions, small arms, demolition munitions, anti-armor mines, tactical vehicles, helmets, body armor, spare parts, maintenance and things like that. So the weapons continue to flow. And the next one here, Russian jamming is making some U.S. weapons ineffective in Ukraine. So the New York Times reported on Saturday that Russian electronic warfare has rendered some U.S.-made precision-guided weapons ineffective on the battlefield in Ukraine, causing Ukrainian forces to stop using certain munitions altogether. One weapon that Ukrainian forces stopped using due to Russian jamming, and this is jamming of the GPS signal, was the Excalibur GPS-guided artillery shells. According to an internal Ukrainian military report, these Excalibur shells were very successful at hitting their targets when the U.S. first sent them in 2022, but the success rate dropped as low as about 5% as its GPS system is very susceptible to Russian electronic warfare. According to the Washington Post, Ukraine reported the problem to the U.S., and the U.S. responded by ending the supply of the Excalibur shells to Ukraine. Several other U.S. weapons suffered a similar fate on the battlefield in Ukraine, with success at first and failure once Russia adapted. And that includes the HIMARS rocket systems, the missiles that they use with that have a range of about 50 miles. When Ukraine first got them, they were kind of touted as a game changer, and they were successful in hitting behind the Russian lines. But according to a Ukrainian official, quote, everything ended. The Russians deployed electronic warfare, disabled satellite signals, and HIMARS became completely ineffective, end quote. So the U.S. recently began providing the long-range ATACMS that have a range of about 190 miles. That they're also fired from the HIMARS systems. So far, Ukraine has had, according to these reports, has had some success, but the military expects Russia eventually to be able to make those missiles ineffective as well. And this is what they're asking to use to hit Russian territory. And what's interesting about this is I remember last year, I think it was last year, I don't know, time passes so quickly now, but I think it was 2023 that Ukraine started getting the ground-launched small diameter bombs, which was like a new thing that Boeing made that had a range of about 94 miles. And then I haven't heard about them for a while, and it looks like they really failed, and Russia was able to jam them and make them ineffective pretty quickly, and Ukraine stopped using them. And Ukraine has also had trouble with joint direct attack munitions, or JDAMs, and those are actually like kits that make what they call dumb bombs into precision-guided bombs. Apparently, they got the weapons manufacturer provided Ukraine with some sort of upgrade for them, and that they've had more success lately, but at least for the time being. And, you know, this is just another thing we hear again, how Russia just has the advantage. And we've heard this from Ukrainian officials just talking about it, but this was both the Washington Post and the New York Times obtained these Ukrainian military reports that detail it and show how, you know, this is a lot of weapon systems that Russia is able to make completely ineffective. All right, so the next one here, Putin is willing to end the war along the current front lines, and this is another one from Kyle that he wrote on Friday, and this is based on a Reuters report, and it says President Vladimir Putin is willing to end the war along the current front lines. Four sources, and this is Reuters' Russian sources, they said that Putin was prepared to freeze the war, but was willing to keep fighting if Ukraine and its Western backers rejected the offer for negotiations. One source said, quote, Putin can fight for as long as it takes, but Putin is also ready for a ceasefire to freeze the war, end quote. When asked by Reuters about the potential for talks, he said, let them resume. So it sounds like he's willing to resume negotiations. The sources speaking with Reuters say that the Russian leader is prepared to assess the territory that has been captured as a victory. One source said, quote, Putin will say that we won, that NATO attacked us and we kept our sovereignty, that we have a land corridor to Crimea, which is true, end quote. So I know I've seen Russia. I didn't see Russian officials deny this report. The response when asked about it seemed to be, well, there's no talks, at the moment. But I think it is really shameful that, it's beyond I don't know what the word is for it, that the U.S. has discouraged negotiations, that in the early days of the war, when there was a real chance for a peace deal, it looks like the U.S. and its close NATO allies did everything they could to discourage the talks and keep this war going. And how many hundreds of thousands of people are dead now because of that? And still, even now, even though there's no chance for Ukraine to win, they're facing defeat along the entire front, and they're trying to, force more Ukrainians to go fight and die. And they're still not saying, all right, it's enough, negotiate. And I think it could just be the fact that there's an election coming up. This is Joe Biden's war. They're not going to want to give up on it before November. That's definitely part of it. They also have very long-term plans, but realistically, are they going to be able to pull them off? I don't know. All right, so the next one here, Israeli strikes kill 8 in southern Lebanon. So this one is from Jason Ditz. A series of Israeli airstrikes and drone attacks on southern Lebanon included hits on 3 motorbikes in different border towns and villages on Sunday. Altogether, at least 8 people were killed and a number of civilian bystanders wounded. So some pretty significant Israeli airstrikes in southern Lebanon, and it looks like there was some rocket fire from Hezbollah across the border in response. No word on casualties on that side. And again, there's over 400 people have been killed on the Lebanon side, and on the Israel side, it's like a few dozen. So there usually is more. When we see these back and forths, there's usually many more casualties on the Lebanon side of the border. So the victims of this attack were not all identified. Some of them were identified as civilians. I'm not sure. It's not clear exactly how many were Hezbollah or how many were civilians. All right, so the next one here, the U.S. to resume sale of offensive arms to Saudi Arabia. So the Financial Times reported on Sunday that the U.S. is expected to resume the sale of offensive weapons to Saudi Arabia. U.S. officials told the paper that President Biden was expected to lift a ban on the sale of offensive weapons to Riyadh that he put in place over 3 years ago, although U.S. support for Saudi Arabia has continued in that time. So this really needs to be put in the proper context. I don't really think there was ever like a ban on selling them offensive weapons because they've sold them some missiles in the meantime, but I'll explain that. So this is something I really followed closely at the time because this is related to the war in Yemen. And in February 2021, right when Biden came in office, he said that he would end offensive support for Saudi Arabia's brutal war in Yemen, and he paused a bomb sale to Riyadh. Does that sound familiar? However, the U.S. continued to support the Saudi bombing campaign, as it was revealed a few months later that the U.S. was still servicing Saudi warplanes. So the U.S. was still maintaining the Saudi warplanes that were bombing Yemen while claiming that they weren't giving them offensive support. And President Biden also continued to push forward arms deals, including a $650 million missile deal. And this was just a few months after he said he was going to end offensive support. The way that they justified it is that these are air-to-air missiles, so they're used to shoot down airplanes. So that's not an offensive weapon. But they also approved the maintenance of helicopters, and there's a big Patriot missile deal, which that is air defense systems. But again, if you're doing that and you're providing maintenance for the Air Force that's bombing Yemen, you're giving them offensive support. And before the Saudis and the Houthis reached a truce at the end of March 2022. Saudi Arabia launched very heavy airstrikes in Yemen. This is early, January, February of 2022. It was one of the deadliest periods of the war for civilians. In January 2022, they killed a bunch of civilians. And the U.S. was still supporting them then. So now there has been the ceasefire, and Saudi Arabia and the Houthis negotiated a peace deal, but it's being blocked by U.S. sanctions. So anyway, the Saudis don't seem interested in restarting the war with the Houthis. I think they're done with that. They've been telling the U.S. to, show restraint and basically stop bombing them, which is really incredible. I mean, they call MBS Bonesaw, Prince Bonesaw, but he's got nothing on Joe Biden, the butcher, whatever we want to call him. I mean, it's really for someone who followed the war in Yemen very closely from when it started. I mean, it's just to see the Saudis calling the U.S. to show restraint in Yemen. It's just something. So anyway, this is more about, I think the U.S. has this like grand scheme. Biden and McGurk on the National Security Council have this big idea that they're going to broker some kind of Saudi-Israel normalization. Israel's going to agree, if we can have relations with Saudi Arabia, then we'll stop, destroying Gaza, and we'll let them fund reconstruction and install some friendly Arab administration, and everybody's going to get along as long as the Saudis and the Israelis normalize relations. In exchange, Saudi Arabia wants a mutual defense commitment from the U.S., which I think they're going to get at some point. And they also want help establishing a civilian nuclear program, just like the U.S. helped Iran establish a civilian nuclear program back in the day. And of course, there's major impediments to this deal. The biggest one is that the Saudis are saying Israel needs to take steps toward a Palestinian state. That's not happening as long as Netanyahu is in power. And there's a good chance of whoever else is in power next also isn't going to let that happen. So it's kind of a pipe dream, I think, this whole scheme that they have. But this is something they're always, I haven't been covering it that much, but it is something that Blinken, Sullivan, whenever they go over to the Middle East, they're like, oh yeah, we talked to the Saudis. They want to normalize with Israel. But then you ask the Saudis and, they were ready to throw the Palestinians under the bus. Before October 7th, that was actually big news that broke not long before it, that the Saudis their condition always was a Palestinian state. That was the only way that they would normalize with Israel. And then they gave up on that condition. And they basically gave up on getting any concessions with regard to the Palestinians. They thought that they could just forget about the issue, but, now they can't. All right, so the next one here, the U.S. calls on Kenya to deploy police to Haiti. So this one is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. So 2 American missionaries were just killed in Haiti, and in response, the White House is pushing Kenya to rush armed men to that country. So the U.S. is trying to back this Kenyan police deployment, which, I've talked about it a bit. Really, it just doesn't seem like the plan is to send 1,000 troops, 1,000 police, and this is going to be funded by the U.S. completely. They're like trying to build a base in Haiti for these police, which apparently that's not done yet. So the initial deployment is going to be 200 police, and judging by the all the reports you read about the violence in Haiti and Port-au-Prince, what are 200 police going to do? I mean, but this is something the U.S. is really pushing, and now with these 2 Americans being killed, it's kind of renewing the push. They were supposed to be there already, but the deployment has been delayed, I think, just because of the situation there and the fact that the base hasn't been built. All right, so the next one here, the last story, China wraps up major drills near Taiwan. So China has completed its, it was about 2 days of drills around Taiwan that it launched in response to William Lai being sworn in as president of Taiwan and the things that he said in his speech. So this article is from the South China Morning Post. The People's Liberation Army ended 2 days of military drills that observers said were the biggest and closest exercises ever held near Taiwan. While there was no official announcement of the drill's end, mainland Chinese media and PLA social media accounts said they lasted 2 days from Thursday. In a post on the WeChat account of the PLA's Eastern Theater Command on Saturday, the command said the exercises by its land, Navy, Air Force, and missile forces were punishment for Taiwan separatists and a severe warning to outside forces intent on interference and provocation. Mainly, this is a warning to the U.S. when they talk about outside forces. And they practiced putting a blockade on Taiwan. They did that when Nancy Pelosi went over there in August 2022. And this map shows the difference. It shows the drills this year are in the purple, the dark purple lines showing where they did the blockade, and then the lighter purples where they did it during Nancy Pelosi. So you could see it was a little more extensive this time, this simulated blockade, and they also did it in some areas near the Taiwanese controlled islands near the mainland, including Kinmen Islands, where now there are some U.S. Green Berets deployed, which is completely insane. But something to keep an eye on. Another thing to keep in mind, so you have the Democratic Progressive Party coming in for the third consecutive term. So certainly, as I said when I covered it last week, emboldened to continue their policies, their independence-leaning policies and close ties with the U.S. At the same time, the legislature is controlled by the opposition, by the Kuomintang and the Taiwan's People's Party, and they want to ease tensions. So that could constrain the DPP quite a bit. But that is it for the news for today. Go check out our viewpoints. One from Ted Galen Carpenter. The U.S. must accept spheres of influence to preserve peace. One from John V. Walsh. The danger is not China, but the fake China threat. So it's a book review of The Fake China Threat by Joseph Solis Mullen, which is a great book. If people want to check it out, it was published by the Libertarian Institute. I have a copy somewhere around here, but it's real short. It's a quick read. So please go check that out if you haven't. One from Zeb Larson and William Minter, Four Blind Mice, Biden, Blinken, McGurk, and Sullivan. One from Gideon Levy, At Last, Justice, but will Israelis start waking up? And our spotlight is from Caitlin Johnstone, We're Still Close to Nuclear Armageddon. That's over at her website, and she quotes a lot of the work that I've done, which is really cool to see that she's always using my articles and stuff, and that's really cool to see. Definitely gives me motivation to keep this going, even though sometimes it feels like, what's the point? But anyway, so go check that out. It's a great story. All right, so that is it for me for today. I hope everyone had a good weekend. If you're off on Memorial Day, enjoy your Monday off. I want to remind everybody, I think I've only mentioned it once so far, that next month in June, I'm going on vacation. June 14th, I'm going to Australia for 2 weeks to visit with my wife's family. And I'm taking off the whole 2 weeks. So there won't be a show, but there's going to be news updated at antiwar.com. I know Kyle Anzalone's going to be doing probably a lot of writing for me, and you could always listen to his great show, Conflicts of Interest, which similar to mine, he does a lot of news stories as well and good analysis. So yeah, I'm going to start telling people earlier in the show for those who don't make it to the end. I don't want it to be a big surprise that all of a sudden this daily news show doesn't come out for a little while. But anyway, that is it for me for today. I will be back tomorrow. Thanks for listening.